It was April 1943. Across the Atlantic the world was burning. But far from the front lines in the heart of Texas, a quiet storm was brewing, one that no one expected. American trains were rumbling across the countryside, their engines echoing through small towns. But these trains weren't filled with soldiers going to fight. Instead, they carried German prisoners of war, men who had been captured during brutal battles in North Africa. The U.S. Army had decided to bring them thousands of miles across the ocean, to live on American soil. By the end of the war, over 425,000 German POWs would be held in the United States, spread across 700 camps from California to Maine. And that's where the story begins. When the first POWs stepped off the trains, many of them couldn't believe what they saw. Instead of rubble and smoke, there were wide open fields, fresh air, and smiling Americans. They were expecting hostility. But what they found was something they never imagined: humanity. In the small towns of America, people were curious. These were the same men whose armies had marched across Europe. Yet now here they were, tired, hungry, and completely under the watchful eye of the U.S. Army, who treated them not as monsters but as men. From the start, the American guards followed the rules of the Geneva Convention strictly. The prisoners received proper food, medical care, and even pay for their labor. While Europe was in ruins, these POWs were eating 3 meals a day, working in the fields, and, most shockingly, being treated with dignity. For many of them, it was the first time they experienced freedom in captivity. American farmers were short on workers because so many young men were overseas fighting. So the U.S. government allowed POWs to work on farms, picking cotton, harvesting crops, and repairing fences. They were paid small wages and coupons they could spend at camp canteens. At first, local residents were nervous. The idea of enemy soldiers walking through their towns sounded terrifying. But the U.S. Army maintained strict order. Every camp had high fences, watchtowers, and armed guards. Discipline was tight, but fair. And over time, something unexpected happened. Americans started to see the prisoners differently. The men weren't invincible enemies anymore. They were sons, fathers, and brothers, just like their own. In Hearne, Texas, the townspeople nicknamed their camp the Fritz Ritz, because the prisoners there were treated so well. The POWs built furniture, grew gardens, and even performed music. And that's when one of the most incredible chapters of this story began. Something that would leave the German prisoners speechless and forever change how they viewed America. It started in small towns with names few outside America had ever heard of. A few local church women, kind-hearted, patriotic, and deeply religious, noticed the POWs working under the hot sun. They saw tired faces, not enemies. And one Sunday morning, an idea began to spread among them. What if they invited some of these men to join their church choirs? It was unheard of. The thought of welcoming prisoners, men who had once fought against American soldiers, into a place of worship shocked many people. But others saw it differently. Because to them, America stood for something bigger than war. It stood for faith, mercy, and the belief that every man could change. Under the supervision of the U.S. Army, the invitations were carefully extended. And when the German prisoners heard the offer, they were stunned. They didn't understand why Americans would show them kindness. After all, they were the enemy. But the U.S. Army believed that even in war, America's values had to shine brighter than hatred. And so, a few brave souls stepped forward. They agreed to go to the local church, not as prisoners but as singers. And that decision would begin one of the most heartwarming, unbelievable stories of World War II. By the end of that first Sunday, even the toughest soldiers couldn't help but feel something shift inside them. They had been taught to hate America, but now, standing in a small-town church surrounded by voices singing together, they felt something else: respect. And for many, it was the beginning of redemption. Because this wasn't just about music. It was about what America stood for: compassion and victory. By June 1943, summer heat rolled across the American South, baking the fields and shimmering the air above the barbed wire fences of the POW camps. Inside those fences, life was surprisingly structured. The U.S. Army, known for its discipline and precision, ran the camps with efficiency few could have imagined. Every day started with roll call at dawn, followed by work assignments, meals, and inspections. The German prisoners, though far from home, quickly learned that life under American supervision was nothing like they expected. They'd been told they'd be starved, beaten, or left to rot. But instead, they were given clean uniforms, decent food, and a schedule that mirrored military order. Many POWs began to realize something that changed them forever. The American Army didn't treat them with cruelty because America didn't fear them. That quiet confidence, rooted in strength, discipline, and faith, made the United States different from any nation they had ever known. In those camps, the U.S. Army built more than fences, they built order out of chaos. Each compound had small libraries, classrooms, workshops, and even recreation areas. The guards encouraged the prisoners to study English, learn trades, and keep busy. It wasn't kindness for its own sake, it was a deliberate decision by the army to keep the men occupied and hopeful. A busy man doesn't think of escape, a hopeful man doesn't stir rebellion. The plan worked perfectly. Some camps even had orchestras, theater performances, and soccer matches. The U.S. Army knew that morale mattered, even for prisoners. They wanted the world to see that America followed the rules, even when no one was watching. The most astonishing transformation began to happen when local communities started to interact with the camps. American farmers noticed that the POWs worked hard. Store owners saw them walking under guard to buy basic items with camp coupons. Slowly, fear turned into familiarity. Children waved from across the fences and sometimes, under supervision, POWs would return those waves with shy smiles. Then came Sundays. The army allowed local pastors and chaplains to hold services inside the camps. Music filled the air, songs of faith, redemption, and peace. That's where the idea of the church choir spread even further. In towns like Camp Swift, Texas, and Camp Atterbury, Indiana, American churchgoers began sending him books and instruments to the camps. The POWs were stunned. They couldn't understand why their captors would help them sing songs of hope. But for the American people, it wasn't about politics. It was about principle. To them, even in the darkest days of war, mercy was strength. And when those POWs sang, something remarkable happened. Their voices, trained in European choral traditions, blended beautifully with the hymns Americans loved. Amazing Grace, Silent Night, The Old Rugged Cross. For a moment, enemies forgot who they were. They were just men singing. Newspapers began to write about it. The story spread. German POWs joined local choirs. Some citizens were shocked, even angry. They asked how America could be so forgiving. But others saw it differently. They saw the U.S. Army not as soft but as righteously strong, a force powerful enough to win wars without losing its humanity. And the POWs noticed. Many later admitted that it was in those camps, not on battlefields, that they first began to question everything they'd believed. They had been told Americans were cruel, selfish, and weak. But instead, they met guards who shared their rations, farmers who offered them water, and women who invited them to sing in church. That was a kind of victory the enemy could never match. The U.S. Army's discipline and compassion didn't just guard the camps, it transformed them into classrooms of character. The POWs learned that freedom wasn't about power or conquest. It was about respect, responsibility, and faith. And as the months passed, the camps began to hum with something new: music, laughter, even friendship. Letters home from POWs described their astonishment. They wrote of clean beds, fair treatment, and Americans who smiled at them in church. Some families back in Germany refused to believe it. How could the enemy live like that? But it was true. Because the United States wasn't just fighting to win a war, it was fighting to prove an idea: that decency, even toward one's enemies, was the greatest show of strength in the world. And soon that idea would lead to a moment so powerful, it would echo for generations. A Christmas unlike any other, when the songs of American choirs and German prisoners would rise together under one roof. It was December 1943, and across America, the first Christmas of peace on home soil in years was beginning to glow. Snow covered small-town rooftops, candles flickered in windows, and families prepared holiday dinners while loved ones fought across the oceans. But inside the wire fences of hundreds of POW camps, something extraordinary was happening. Something that no one could have predicted when those prisoners first stepped off the trains months earlier. For the German prisoners, Christmas had always been sacred, a time of family, faith, and song. They expected this one to be filled with loneliness and silence. Instead, the U.S. Army had other plans. Under strict yet compassionate leadership, officers began allowing limited Christmas programs inside the camps. The order came from the top: even enemies deserve to remember their humanity. So, on a cold morning in December, the prisoners began preparing. They built makeshift decorations from scrap wood and paper, painted stars using leftover rations, and shaped tree ornaments from tin cans. But what truly set this Christmas apart was the music. American chaplains, local pastors, and church choirs had been visiting the camps for months, teaching hymns, sharing instruments, and encouraging harmony. Now, those same choirs were planning to sing alongside the prisoners for the first time. When the news spread through towns, reactions were mixed. Some citizens couldn't understand it. Their sons were still overseas fighting. How could they sing Christmas carols with enemy soldiers? But others, especially the women who had started the idea, said something that touched hearts everywhere. If our boys can fight with courage, we can love with courage. And so, on Christmas Eve, small-town churches across America opened their doors to a scene the world would never forget. In Camp Atterbury, Indiana, candles lined the aisles of a local church. The U.S. Army stood guard outside, rifles slung over their shoulders, while inside German prisoners stood shoulder to shoulder with American townsfolk. The first notes of Silent Night filled the room. It started softly, an old carol they all knew. But then something magical happened. The POWs began singing too in their own language. Their voices, trained, deep, and hauntingly beautiful, rose through the church rafters. For a moment, English and German blended together in perfect harmony. Two nations at war, one song of peace. People in the congregation began to cry. Soldiers wiped their eyes. Even some of the prisoners couldn't hold back tears. They had been taught to fear America, but now they were standing in a church, welcomed not as enemies but as men. The next morning, newspapers across the region told the story. Enemy POWs joined choir in Christmas service. The world was stunned. But the U.S. Army stood firm in its defense. The commanding officers explained that this act wasn't about weakness. It was about American strength of spirit. The same army that could crush any enemy on the battlefield could also show mercy without losing pride. And that, more than any weapon, was what made America powerful. Over time, that Christmas service became legendary in the camps. Prisoners spoke about it for years. Many said it was the first time they truly understood what freedom meant. Freedom, they realized, wasn't just about land or flags. It was about character, the ability to forgive, to hope, and to believe in something greater than yourself. In the following weeks, the choir program grew. More camps joined. More churches opened their doors. And slowly, letters began traveling across the Atlantic. Letters written by POWs to their families back home. They described America not as the cruel place they were warned about, but as a land of fairness and faith. Some even wrote that they hoped to return one day, not as prisoners but as free men. The U.S. Army had achieved something far greater than controlling prisoners. It had won their respect. And that respect began to ripple far beyond the fences. Local communities noticed fewer tensions. Guards and prisoners developed quiet trust. When the Army called for volunteers to help with rebuilding tasks, the POWs lined up. They were no longer just following orders. They were participating, because they believed in the justice of the men who led them. By the end of that winter, something profound had taken root. Those church choirs had become more than music. They were bridges between worlds. Men who once saw each other through rifle scopes were now bound by the shared language of faith. And in every note sung that Christmas, the message was clear. America could conquer enemies without losing its soul. By February 1944, the war still thundered overseas, but here in America, something remarkable was unfolding behind barbed wire. In dozens of POW camps scattered across the country, music had taken on a life of its own. What began as a few hesitant voices in a Texas church had turned into a growing movement, one that even the U.S. Army couldn't ignore. Commanding officers began to notice a transformation among the prisoners. Discipline was sharper. Work output improved. Tensions between guards and POWs dropped dramatically. And morale, on both sides of the fence, was higher than anyone could have imagined. The Army recognized the power of this change. It wasn't weakness. It was psychological strength, a victory of values. So, under careful supervision, they began allowing something new: choir visits. A few times each month, small groups of German POWs, always escorted by armed guards, were permitted to travel to nearby towns to perform for local congregations. For the prisoners, these trips were like glimpses of a world they never thought they'd see again. They rode through the countryside, past open fields and waving children. Many later recalled how strange it felt to be on American roads, not as soldiers or captives but as singers. The townsfolk gathered in curious crowds. At first, they came to see the enemy choir. But soon they came to listen. Because when those men sang, something extraordinary happened. Their harmonies, rich, emotional, and deeply human, filled the small churches with a sound that no one expected from prisoners. Songs like "Nearer, My God, to Thee" and "Ave Maria" carried through the halls, blending German precision with American warmth. People listened in silence, many in tears. They weren't just hearing music. They were hearing reconciliation. The U.S. Army officers overseeing these programs took pride in what was happening. America was showing the world that it could fight fiercely and still stand for compassion. It was the Army's discipline that made it possible. The clear boundaries, the strict order, and the unshakable moral leadership that ensured peace inside those camps. Without that foundation, none of this could have worked. Soon, stories spread far beyond the towns. Reporters began covering these performances. "Prisoners sing for peace," read one headline. Another called it, "Harmony behind barbed wire." For the American public, weary of years of war, these stories became a quiet symbol of hope, a sign that goodness could still exist in the chaos. But for the POWs, it was something deeper. They began to understand what made the United States so different. In their homeland, obedience came from fear. But in America, order came from respect. The soldiers who guarded them didn't rule with anger, they led with confidence. Even in captivity, the prisoners could see the foundation of American power, a balance of strength and mercy. In one camp in Colorado, a chaplain noted in his journal that the POW choir had performed for more than 300 townspeople. Afterward, the audience stood and applauded for several minutes. He wrote, "It was not applause for their voices, it was applause for their humanity." The prisoners never forgot moments like that. Many began using their free time to study English, read the Bible, or write poetry. Some even painted murals inside the camps, depicting peaceful countryside scenes of both America and Europe, side by side. It was as if the music had unlocked something buried deep inside them. And the U.S. Army encouraged it all, not out of naivety, but because it understood something essential. Victory isn't only won on battlefields, it's won in hearts. Each performance, each handshake after a service, each moment of shared music, these were quiet battles of ideology that America was winning effortlessly. Because every note sung, every kind gesture given, was proof that America's strength wasn't just in its weapons, it was in its character. By spring of 1944, the choirs had become a symbol of peace inside war. Some Americans even began sending the prisoners letters of gratitude, thanking them for reminding the world of what hope sounded like. In one letter, an American woman wrote, "When you sang in our church, it reminded us that no war can silence goodness." That line was copied, translated, and passed from one camp to another. Soon, POWs all over the country knew it by heart. And in their own way they began to believe it too. By the time the war would end, many of these men would return home changed forever. But the seeds of that transformation, the first cracks in old hatred, were planted right here in small American churches, where enemy voices rose in praise beside their captors. The choirs had done more than sing. They had shown the world that the American spirit was unbreakable. By May 1944, the winds of war were shifting. The Allied forces were preparing for major offensives overseas, and in the United States, the prison camps had settled into an unexpected rhythm of peace. The U.S. Army continued to run the camps with precision and discipline, but now they had a new mission, one far beyond containment. They wanted to teach. For the first time in modern history, an army wasn't just capturing enemy soldiers, it was educating them. Inside the camps, the army began introducing programs focused on democracy, ethics, and freedom. Military psychologists and chaplains worked together to develop classes on history, government, and civic values. The goal was simple yet revolutionary: show these prisoners what it truly meant to live in a free society. And it worked because America didn't preach, it demonstrated. Every day the POWs saw order without oppression, power without cruelty, and faith without fear. They watched guards share meals with one another regardless of rank. They saw officers treat enlisted men with dignity. They saw churches welcome anyone through their doors. To men who had grown up in rigid, hierarchical systems, this was stunning. In one camp in Kansas, a prisoner later recalled that what impressed him most wasn't the food or the freedom, it was the fairness. He said, "In America, even a private could speak to a colonel with respect, and the colonel listened." That simple observation became one of the most powerful lessons the POWs learned. The U.S. Army believed that the way to win lasting peace was to rebuild minds, not just defeat armies. So, they invested in something called re-education programs, classes that taught democratic ideals, literature, and even journalism. Instructors, often American soldiers fluent in German, taught the prisoners how democracy worked, not as propaganda but as practice. They held debates, elections for camp councils, and discussions about justice and leadership. The prisoners began publishing their own camp newspapers, writing about life in captivity, art, music, and philosophy. Every article had to be approved by U.S. officers, but the Army encouraged honesty and reflection. They wanted these men to think critically, to understand, not just obey. And that was the difference. The U.S. Army's strength came from the belief that freedom and discipline could coexist. A soldier could be obedient yet thoughtful, patriotic yet compassionate. That lesson began spreading among the POWs like wildfire. Soon their daily routines weren't just about survival, they were about transformation. Men who once saw themselves as enemies began to see themselves as students of a new kind of power, moral power. And the impact of the church choirs continued to grow. The music that had once brought two sides together now served as a living example of what cooperation could create. Choir rehearsals became informal lessons in trust, teamwork, and equality. When they sang, rank didn't matter. Guard or prisoner, American or foreigner, every voice carried equal weight. It was a small but profound glimpse of democracy in action. Many American guards began noticing something remarkable. The prisoners no longer needed constant watching. Escape attempts dropped dramatically. Some POWs even turned in fellow prisoners who tried to break rules. The camps were still secure, but the real walls, the ones in their minds, were starting to crumble. One Army report from Camp Shelby, Mississippi, noted that prisoners had shown measurable shifts in attitude, expressing admiration for the fairness and strength of the American command. In other words, they were changing from the inside out. And the Army understood that this was the most powerful kind of victory, the kind that didn't end when the guns stopped firing. By early summer, the choirs were invited to sing at Memorial Day services, honoring fallen American soldiers. That day, POWs stood in uniform rows, heads bowed as the Star-Spangled Banner played. Some even sang along. For the Americans who witnessed it, it was unforgettable. And for the prisoners, it was transformative. Many said later that it was the moment they truly understood what respect for freedom meant. Because the United States had done something no empire in history had achieved. It had conquered its enemies not only with force but with example. Through education, fairness, and faith, the U.S. Army had turned prison camps into classrooms of democracy. And within those classrooms, an entire generation of men who once opposed America began to admire it deeply. The seeds planted in 1944 would grow into something extraordinary after the war ended, something that would change not just their lives but the future of two nations. But before that happened, the world would face one more dark chapter, and the lessons these prisoners learned in America would soon be tested in the ruins of Europe. It was May 1945, and across the world, the thunder of war finally began to fade. The Allied victory was complete. The guns fell silent. And for the first time in 6 long years, peace returned to the earth. In the United States, celebrations erupted from coast to coast. Flags waved in every town, bells rang from every church, and tears of relief filled the eyes of millions. But inside the quiet prison camps scattered across America, another kind of victory was unfolding, one that had nothing to do with battlefields and everything to do with the human heart. The German POWs, thousands of them, had just learned the war was over. They gathered in silence as American officers stood before them and announced the news. For many, it felt like a strange mix of joy, shame, and confusion. They had lost the war. But they had also discovered something far more powerful during their time in America: what true freedom looked like. And now the U.S. Army faced a new mission, sending these men home. Over the next months, the Army organized massive transport operations to return POWs across the Atlantic. It was one of the largest repatriation efforts in history. But before any man could leave, the Army made sure they understood one final lesson: how America had won not just with might but with morals. As the prisoners packed their few belongings, many asked for one final thing before leaving: copies of English books, hymnals, or letters from American friends. Some even requested to attend one last Sunday service with the church choirs that had once welcomed them. The Army allowed it. Those final gatherings were emotional beyond words. Soldiers who had once guarded prisoners now stood side by side with them, singing the same hymns that had united them through the hardest of times. Amazing Grace echoed through the chapels of camps in Texas, Oklahoma, and Illinois. The men who once fought under different flags now sang of redemption together. When the time came to board the ships home, many prisoners turned back to wave, some saluting, others simply whispering thank you in broken English. One American guard at Camp Hearn, Texas, wrote in his diary, "They came to us as enemies. They left as men." And it was true. Because when those former prisoners arrived back in Europe, they didn't return the same. They returned with stories. Stories of how the U.S. Army had treated them with fairness. How American families had smiled at them even through pain. How churches had opened their doors. And how, in the land they were told to fear, they had found respect and dignity. In the broken cities of post-war Europe, those stories spread quickly. Former POWs told their families, their neighbors, and even their local officials about what they'd seen. They spoke of American democracy not as propaganda, but as lived experience. Many said, "If America can forgive, then so can we." These men, once soldiers of an enemy army, became unlikely ambassadors of peace. They carried with them the lessons they'd learned in the camps, that true strength comes not from cruelty but from compassion. Historians later called it the silent diplomacy of decency. Without a single speech, the U.S. Army had reshaped the hearts of thousands. Decades later, researchers discovered that many former POWs who had lived in the United States became strong advocates for rebuilding democracy in Europe. Some became teachers, some musicians, and a few even pastors. They taught their children about fairness, respect, and responsibility, the very values they had witnessed inside those American camps. One of them famously said, "America defeated us twice, once with weapons and once with kindness." It was the second victory that lasted. In Germany, years after the war, community choirs began to form, inspired by memories of those Sunday mornings in American churches. They sang the same songs, Silent Night, The Old Rugged Cross, Amazing Grace. To them, those weren't just hymns anymore. They were symbols of a new beginning. And in letters exchanged years later, many POWs thanked their American captors, writing that they had found the best of humanity in the heart of our enemy. That was the power of America, the nation that could fight harder than anyone, yet still show compassion when it mattered most. The U.S. Army didn't just win a war. It proved that character could conquer hate. And for every man who left those camps, that truth stayed with him forever. They had come as prisoners of war. They left as witnesses to America's greatness. It was 1946, a new year, a new world. Across Europe, cities were rebuilding from ashes. Bridges were rising where bombs once fell, and hope, fragile but growing, was returning. Yet beneath that rebuilding lay something invisible but powerful, the influence of America's example. The men who had been held in POW camps across the United States were now back home, scattered through war-torn villages and shattered cities. They carried no weapons, no medals, and no orders. What they carried instead were memories. Memories of a country that had treated them like human beings, even when it had every reason not to. And those memories began changing everything. In town meetings, classrooms, and churches across Europe, these former prisoners began speaking quietly about what they had seen. They spoke of American soldiers who were firm but fair, of churches that opened their doors to strangers, and of choirs that erased the sound of war with the sound of grace. Many of them had never known kindness during the war. But they had found it in captivity, in the hands of the very men they were taught to hate. The idea spread like a quiet revolution. Maybe the future didn't have to be built on revenge. Maybe it could be built on respect. And that shift in mindset, subtle but real, would become one of the foundations of the post-war alliance between the United States and Europe. Because when those men returned home, they became the first living proof that the American system worked, not just in theory but in the hearts of men. Historians would later trace parts of Europe's democratic revival to the influence of these POWs. Many had learned about free elections, fair leadership, and accountability from the U.S. Army's re-education programs. They had seen democracy in action, on parade grounds, in mess halls, and even in church choirs. When they spoke about America, they didn't describe a conqueror. They described a teacher. One prisoner who returned to Bavaria later became a school principal. He told his students, "The Americans taught me that discipline and kindness can live in the same heart." Another, a young man from Saxony, became a local journalist. He wrote, "I learned more about freedom behind American fences than I ever did in the streets of my own city." Stories like these spread slowly but powerfully. And as Europe began to rebuild, the United States extended its hand again, this time not as a captor but as a partner. The Marshall Plan poured aid into shattered nations, rebuilding factories, roads, and schools. But more than that, it rebuilt trust. And much of that trust had already been seeded years earlier, inside those quiet POW camps, where American guards had treated their prisoners not with vengeance, but with dignity. The choir programs, those small, simple acts of music and faith, became legendary symbols of this kindness. Decades later, historians uncovered camp journals and church records describing those moments in vivid detail. One American pastor wrote, "We thought we were teaching hymns. But we were teaching hope." Even decades later, former prisoners returned to America to visit the towns where they had once been held. Many sought out the churches that had welcomed them. They hugged the families who had once waved to them through fences. In Hearne, Texas, a group of former POWs returned in the 1960s to see the old camp grounds. Standing on the grass where the barracks once stood, one of them whispered, "This was the place where I met real freedom." By then the world had changed. The United States and Europe were allies, standing together in the Cold War. The same soldiers who once guarded those men were now helping protect their countries from new threats. The friendships formed in captivity had turned into alliances forged in peace. And through it all, the reputation of the U.S. Army stood tall, not only as the most powerful fighting force on earth, but as a moral leader. It was an army that could fight with unmatched strength and still embody mercy and victory. This legacy became part of America's identity. It was what made the country admired, not just for its might but for its magnanimity. For decades, European leaders would look back on those years with gratitude. Some even wrote that the American camps were the first schools of democracy for a new generation of men. All of it, every heart changed, every friendship formed, had begun with a simple act of faith in the middle of a war. A few American women had once looked through barbed wire and seen not enemies but souls. They invited those men to sing. And that invitation, to join a choir, echoed far louder than any gunfire ever could. It was April 1947, 2 years after the war's end. The camps were nearly empty now. The fences that had once divided captors and captives stood silent under the sun, slowly rusting away. But in the small American towns that had once hosted those prisoners, places like Hearne, Texas, Camp Atterbury, Indiana, and Camp Shelby, Mississippi, the echoes of something beautiful still lingered. The music. For the townspeople, the choirs had been more than entertainment. They had been proof that goodness could survive even the darkest of times. For the prisoners, those same songs had become a bridge from guilt to grace, from defeat to dignity. And though the camps closed, the story never did. In the years that followed, those who had lived through it carried the memory forward. American guards told their children about the strange days when they stood watch over enemy soldiers who sang Silent Night beside them. Former POWs told their grandchildren about the kindness of the U.S. Army and the churches that welcomed them as brothers. For both sides, the lesson was the same. America had shown the world a new kind of victory. Not the victory of domination but the victory of decency. Even decades later, the story kept resurfacing, sometimes in old newspaper clippings, sometimes in letters discovered in attics. A handful of aging veterans and former prisoners reunited in the 1980s, sitting together in American pews, singing the same hymns that had once united them in captivity. They didn't sing as enemies or even as former soldiers. They sang as men who had discovered, in the middle of a war, that compassion is the truest sign of strength. And that was the quiet genius of the U.S. Army. While the rest of the world saw victory as something to seize, America saw it as something to protect. The Army didn't just guard its borders, it guarded its values. Behind every act of discipline was integrity. Behind every order was respect. And behind every barbed wire fence stood a belief that even an enemy could one day be a friend. The United States had fought with unmatched courage and emerged with its soul intact. It proved to the world that power doesn't have to corrupt, that true greatness comes not from how you win wars, but from how you treat those you've defeated. That's why, even today, historians look back on the POW camps in America as one of the most extraordinary stories of World War II. A story of faith, forgiveness, and the quiet strength of a nation that refused to lose its humanity. Because long after the soldiers went home, the songs remained. In one small Texas town, a choir still sings Amazing Grace every Christmas Eve in honor of that moment in history. And in Germany, a few descendants of former POWs still gather in local churches to sing the same hymn, in both English and German. Two sides of the world. One melody. The legacy lives on because America dared to believe that kindness could be stronger than fear. That's what made the U.S. Army not just a military force, but a moral one. It showed the world that you can fight with might and still lead with mercy. That you can conquer nations and still lift others up. That you can hold your enemies in chains, and still free their hearts. So when we remember the great battles and victories of World War II, we must also remember this one. The victory that happened not on foreign soil, but in the quiet towns of America, where compassion sang louder than cannon fire. The day American women invited prisoners to join their church choirs, they did more than sing a hymn. They wrote a verse in the song of history, a song that still reminds us who we are, and what we can be when we choose to lead with courage, with honor, and with heart. Because in the end, the truest strength of America has never been in its weapons or wealth. It has always been in its humanity. And that is the song that never ended.